Thank you and welcome for giving up your time this evening to come and listen to some information about what's happening on our beaches and the Securing the Future of Our Coastline project. My name's James Guy. Busily working away in the background are Linda and Janet, part of our communications team, who you would potentially bump into if you go and see our information caravan out on site or any of the other community events we run. They do a fantastic job of organising all these events. So thanks to Janet and Linda for putting this session together. First thing I'd like to do is just acknowledge that this land we meet on today is the traditional lands for Kaurna people, even though we're meeting virtually, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. We also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people attending from other areas of South Australia or present here. Just how we plan to run tonight. Obviously we can be a bit less formal with less people, so we can be flexible. I will just give a very short presentation, just a real snapshot of why we manage Adelaide's beaches and how we manage Adelaide's beaches. And then we'll move straight into a Q&A function, whether we can put your hand up and chat or type in questions as I go. And very much that the majority of the session will be driven by you, and happy to respond to anything you'd like to talk about or questions that you may have. And we did have the event closing at 8:30 p.m. sharp, but depending on how we go, if you run out of questions, obviously we'll finish before then. The webinar is being recorded, but I understand that there won't be any of your faces or images shown as part of that recording, but just be aware that we are recording it for reference purposes, and we may look to make it available if you wanted to look at any information subsequently. As I said, I will give a very brief introduction as the project manager of Securing the Future of Our Coastline into what's going on our beaches and why we need to manage our beaches, what's happening with the project, where we're up to with the project, and then move straight into asking questions. Lots of opportunity for questions. This is the fourth one of these sessions. We've had 3 in face-to-face ones, 2 up at Semaphore and 1 last night at West Beach. And there has been lots of good discussion about what's going on, questions on lots of topics about the project, the history of Adelaide's beaches, why we're doing what we're doing. So, the management of Adelaide's beaches. Why do we manage Adelaide's beaches? And this is something that often, people often get the second bullet point of this. It's all about managing sandy beaches and having beautiful sandy beaches. But one of the primary purposes for the Coast Protection Board, in terms of its management of Adelaide's beaches, is to protect coastal infrastructure. So a lot of the activities we do are actually primarily directed at protecting coastal infrastructure along our beaches. Obviously, a secondary benefit and a major benefit is the beautiful sandy beaches that we get to enjoy, and that is also a key aspect of it. But the fundamental purpose is to provide protection of coastal infrastructure. If we weren't actively managing our beaches, you can see in this picture that I've just put up from 1968, we wouldn't have sand on a large number of our beaches. So this is Glenelg Beach following storms in 1968. The beaches along our coast, particularly the central and southern beaches, are a thin layer of sand over the top of rock and clay. So this just shows Glenelg Beach with no sand on it. It's washed all the sand away in a storm, and it's basically down to the rock and clay. So we do need to manage our beaches, otherwise we wouldn't have beaches along significant stretches of our coast. So just to highlight that, some historical pictures here. Down at the southern end of the coast at Seacliff Hotel in 1960. This is a good image, and I'm just checking, hopefully you can see my mouse. Can you see that on your screens?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. So you can see that various different types of protection here. At the left-hand side of the picture, that recurved concrete wall, we've got a timber protection structure that's gone along at the base. We've got dumped rock in front of that and dumped rock behind it. And this is obviously the Seacliff Hotel behind it. So you can see the sorts of issues that were being dealt with historically down at Seacliff. Glenelg, 1953 storm. Again, all the sand washed off the beach, foreshore, significant damage to the foreshore. Moving further north along the coast, this is up at Semaphore Park at Marani Court. In the 80s, throughout the late 70s and most of the 80s, Semaphore Park was a real erosion hotspot, to the extent that there was a major study done on Semaphore Park itself and what should be done to manage the erosion there, which led to, as part of that strategy, construction of the Semaphore Park offshore breakwater. So this is just showing that type of storm damage that was occurring during reasonably severe storm events that happened regularly. And right up the northern end, that's a very early picture, 1923, of the Semaphore Palais. And important to note there, you've got that vertical concrete wall. This is the year after it was built. Vertical wall right in front of the Semaphore Palais and no dunes. So why do we have this need to manage our beaches? What's driving those processes? Adelaide's beaches lie obviously in Gulf St Vincent. We've got Kangaroo Island and York Peninsula blocking all the swell energy other than from the southwest. So the only swell energy that can get into Adelaide's beaches from long distances, from the Antarctic storms, is from the southwest. And then we've got what we call sea waves, the sea state, which is locally generated chop. That's those choppy short waves that are generated by sea breezes, which, if you think of our summer sea breezes, they are predominantly from the southwest as well. So you've got those wind and waves all coming from the southwest that are moving sand from south to north along our coast. And I like to talk about this as a river of sand. A technical term is literal drift, but the actual way I like to describe that is as a river of sand moving from south to north along our coast. Adelaide's beaches are actually a closed system. There's very little sand coming in from the southern end of the system. So down at Merino Rocks, that's why Merino Rocks is rocky. There's very little sand coming from further south along the coastline into the system. It's a closed system. Historically, what's happened is that erosion, as these southwesterly wind and waves have moved the sand northwards, we're getting erosion of the southern end, and the erosion of those dunes is feeding that river of sand that moves northwards, and that has actually created Lefevre Peninsula. So you can see 7,000 years ago when sea levels stabilised, that was the rough Adelaide Plains terminated there. Every 1,000 years with that northward movement of sand, it's continued to move further north, create Lefevre Peninsula and erode the southern end, which eroding the dunes to feed that river of sand. So you can see at the very southern end of the system, down at the Seacliff Hotel, one of the first buildings to go down in on the dunes, you can see those wild dunes behind it. Those substantial dune systems is what was eroding and feeding the river of sand moving northwards along our coast. Of course, we came and developed along that dune system, locked all that sand up beneath development. The Esplanade has gone in by this stage. We've got the suburbs creeping in over the sand dunes. And already you can start to see protection works having to go in, because nature wants to do what it has been doing, which is erode these dunes and move the sand northwards along the coast. We've put infrastructure in the way. And straight after that, in the 50s and 60s, every storm event, major erosion along the coastline. Again, nature trying to erode those dunes and eroding back under the Esplanade, causing infrastructure damage. At the other end of the system, all that sand moving northwards. To note at this end, we've got as that ongoing process of building Lefevre Peninsula from sand. Here we've got Lady Gowrie Drive, no dunes at all. High tide is right up to the base of the road. And then middle of last year, an aerial image of that same area showing the 100 to 120 metres of dunes that have accumulated just since 1936 through until 2020. So you can see that progressive process of accumulation of sand at the northern end of the system. So that's why sand moves along our coast and why we need to undertake management. Essentially, Adelaide's beaches are managed, and this has been the case since the 1970s. The background to this is that in the 50s, 60s, those storms were causing major damage. At that stage, each council was responsible for managing its own section of coast. There was 12 councils along the Metropolitan Coast. They got together, formed the Metropolitan Seaside Councils Committee, which still exists, to lobby state government to say this problem is beyond individual councils. There needs to be a coordinated approach to managing Adelaide's beaches. The government commissioned the first major study of Adelaide's coastline, which became known as the Culver Report by the University of Adelaide, and it proposed quite an innovative solution for those times in the late 60s and 1970s to move sand from areas where it builds up back to areas of erosion to mimic that natural dune process. So to create a dune buffer, which it was known would erode during storm events as it fed that northward littoral drift, and then bring the sand back. So effectively recycle sand and provide protection from storms by having a dune buffer. By doing that, obviously also, that dune sand, as it's eroded and feeds into the beach system, maintains a sandy beach as well for public amenity. He did acknowledge that there's structures where necessary, and one of the key critical elements as well was revegetation and dune stabilisation. So that's been the fundamental approach to managing Adelaide's beaches since 1972 with the formation of the Coast Protection Board. This is the major studies and reviews. Approximately every decade, there's been a major review of the management of Adelaide's beaches, starting with that initial Culver report, which led to the creation of the Coast Protection Board and the state government taking responsibility for managing the sand along Adelaide's beaches. 1984, there was another major review. 1992, another review. 1997, a public inquiry led by the then Minister David Watton, which commissioned three major reports looking at the potential to dredge sand from offshore to bring it onshore, and recommended a number of studies, which led to the next major review, the Adelaide's Living Beaches strategy in 2005, and culminating more recently in the West Beach Coastal Processes study. You might have heard it referred to as the DHI study in 2018. Obviously, I'm taking a real whistle-stop tour through the history of the management of Adelaide's beaches. I just wanted to point out that there is this fantastic resource on our website, the Adelaide's Living Beaches Technical Report. It gives a full history of the management of Adelaide's beaches up until 2005. So it talks about all those previous major studies, looks at what recommendations were made, what recommendations were implemented, all the historic information, excuse me, about the management of Adelaide's beaches up until that point in time in 2005. So then we come to the Securing the Future of Our Coastline project. Why the need for the Securing the Future of Our Coastline project? The critical element is that the Adelaide's Living Beaches strategy, which was undertaken in 2005, looked at still each one of those major reviews said replenishment was still the preferred way to manage Adelaide's beaches. So every decade that major review said, yes, we still believe that replenishing sand, recycling sand, maintaining dune buffers is the preferred approach because it maintains those sandy beaches as well. The Adelaide's Living Beaches strategy said, yes, that still is the preferred approach, but let's do it in a more efficient way, using a sand pumping system rather than the trucking that had been used up until that time. So until then, there'd been that annual trucking program to move sand. They said, let's build a pipeline from Kingston Park in the south all the way to Semaphore in the north to give us a way to move sand from area to area, because it acknowledged the changes that had happened in terms of the construction of Holdfast Shores, the construction of the West Beach Boat Harbour, these major obstructions to that river of sand moving along the coast. It looked at, instead of picking up sand all the way from one end and bringing it back, managing sand within those compartments, or management cells they were called, where they picked up sand from each obstruction and recycled it within that management cell, proposing to do that with a pipeline. When they went to tenders came back in over the budget. That pipeline project, by the way, went all the way through to development approval, conceptual design, public consultation, development approval in 2008, went out to tender for construction. Tenders came in over the budget. The decision was made, had to be made whether to increase the budget or reduce the scope. The decision was made at that time to reduce the scope of the project. So what was delivered with Adelaide's Living Beaches was a pipeline from Glenelg to Kingston Park and a pipeline at West Beach. The pipeline extending through to Semaphore was not delivered. The decision was made to continue managing bringing sand back by truck. That led to a number of issues at West Beach because we weren't able to bring back enough sand to match the rate of sand leaving West Beach within the existing resources. Trucking is much more expensive than pumping sand. It's much more disruptive. So that led to us acknowledging those issues we had in West Beach, commissioning that DHI study in 2018 to look at what's going on at West Beach. Why are we still getting erosion despite the fact that we're recycling 70,000 cubic metres a year of sand per year using the pumping system at West Beach? That was based on those previous studies that said that's the rate of sand leaving West Beach. The DHI study said, okay, based on our new model that they set up with the world's strongest newest technology in terms of supercomputers and analysing our survey data, they concluded that about 100,000 cubic metres of sand each year was moving northwards out of West Beach, up along the coast towards the north. So there was that discrepancy between we were recycling the previous understanding, the best estimate of what was happening within that section of coast of about 70,000 cubic metres per year. We were still seeing ongoing erosion. That study confirmed that, yes, we weren't actually matching that rate of sand moving out. So the DHI study looked at a range of options. They modelled a range of different scenarios, structural solutions, offshore breakwaters, mass replenishment with sand from the northern beaches, mass replenishment with sand from an external source outside of our beaches, and construction of a pipeline to bring sand back. That report was presented to the Coast Protection Board, who then analysed those options and recommended to government the Securing the Future of Our Coastline strategy, what's been adopted within the government's Securing the Future of Our Coastline strategy. So the key elements of that project, just to touch on that quickly, an acknowledgement that sand has been lost from West Beach over the last 15 years. They calculated that amount of sand that had been lost since 2005 as being about 440,000 cubic metres of sand. So it said we need to bring about that much sand back into West Beach to reinstate it back to what it was. So that's that add 500,000 cubic metres of sand to West Beach from external sources. It also said once we've rebuilt West Beach, replaced that sand that's been lost, brought it back to those levels of about 2005, the year 2005, we need to also build that sand pumping pipeline that was originally proposed back in 2005 to efficiently be able to bring sand back, whatever sand that leaves West Beach each year, bring it back to hold the volume of sand in West Beach stable. So the two key elements of the project, bring in sand from an outside source to rebuild the sand in West Beach, replace the sand that's been lost, then build the pipeline to be able to hold that sand there by bringing it back each year, recycle the sand to match the rate that's lost. It was also acknowledged that that was going to take some time to plan, design, go through public consultation, procure and build. And in the interim, you see that first activity, undertake the trucking. So that's the trucking we've been doing for the last 18 months to hold, stabilise West Beach, stop that loss of sand, address the erosion and issues while we deliver the other two components. The final component is once we get all that extra sand in and we're able to recycle it efficiently, is that we need to stabilise that sand. So that might be things like drift net fencing, which you've probably seen along the coastline, and revegetation works. So they're the four key elements. Just a quick update on where we're at with those elements of the project. As I said, the immediate increase that's been implemented, we've been able to successfully, DHI, we engaged them to update the volume analysis of how much sand is in West Beach as of January this year. And we have been able to stabilise that loss of sand in West Beach. The graph of the sand loss in West Beach was very negative, heading downhill. We've been able to stabilise that and bring it back up a little bit, and that's seen us being able to better manage West Beach. In terms of the sand pumping system, the Department for Transport and Infrastructure are delivering that on behalf of our department. They are the government's infrastructure agency. They've engaged a contractor to design and construct that system. That's McConnell Dowell, a consortia led by McConnell Dowell. They're the ones who designed and built the existing pumping system and operate the existing pumping system. So they've started design work as of about 2 to 3 weeks ago. They were engaged. They're taking information that's been given to us by a community reference group that we've been having discussions with about what are some of the design principles about that pipeline. And they're starting to work now on what a draft alignment of that pipeline is. And we're hoping that within about 6 to 8 weeks, we will have a conceptual alignment to start consulting on, to start going out to the community and saying, here's the conceptual alignment, what are the issues, what's the feedback on that system. So that's moving forward, and we would expect that will be moving towards a development application and construction commencing later this calendar year. In terms of the external sand, you may have heard some information in the media. It was hoped that 500,000 cubic metres of sand would be coming from an offshore source at Port Stanback. That sand, there was 1.1 million cubic metres of sand dredged from offshore Port Stanback during the 1990s in 4 separate campaigns and put into the southern end of the beach system at Brighton. With the closure of Mobile, there was a previously restricted area that now became accessible to us. So it was hoped that that area would be consistent with the other deposits of sand in that area, and that's where we will be sourcing this sand from. We've been investigating that in detail last year, including going out there and taking core samples. Unfortunately, that sand, the remaining sand that's out there is sand out there. It's finer than we would like for beach replenishment. It's finer and lighter and therefore moves more quickly along the beach rather than the heavier, larger grain sizes. But perhaps more importantly, it's got a high percentage of clay and silt content in it. And that means that if you dredge it, you can run the risk of causing a plume. So we undertook plume modelling for a typical dredging campaign that we ran over 60 days, looked at what the potential implications were in terms of the plume that could be caused by that dredging, and the risk was too high. So that we won't be progressing with the Port Stanback offshore sand source. The remaining two sources that have been identified historically, there's one called the Section Bank, north of Outer Harbour. Large deposits of sand, the core samples have been taken from there in the late 70s, late 80s, 87, and in the early 2000s. There's a large volume of good sand out there. There are significant environmental issues that we need to address to do with the Section Bank. There are seagrass meadows in that area. There's mangroves to the landward side of it. And there's also the Pacific oyster mortality syndrome, the POMS virus in the Port River. It hasn't been established whether it's out on the Section Bank, but we need to assume that it could be out there based on it being detected in the Port River since 2016. That has potentially significant impacts on the oyster industry in South Australia. So there's risks that we need to investigate and address there. The other known source of external sand is quarries, commercial quarries. We've also been running trials over the last 12 months in discussions with quarries around potential products. We did a small scale trial at West Beach in December with a placement of 9 different quarry sand products. So we're continuing those investigations of the quarry sand as a potential source of sand. It is more expensive than dredged sand, but it is a high quality coarse sand that performs very well on the beach. So those investigations are continuing. We hope to have some further information out on the very near future. The dune stabilisation and revegetation, that will occur once we've got that mass replenishment delivered. So look, that was really what I wanted to do in terms of a whistle-stop tour of going through why we manage Adelaide's beaches, how we manage it, and what the project is. And really, I'm happy to turn it over now to questions. So here we go. I can already see some up there. Shall we start with K's? Some questions about the pipeline and the effects of climate change. Okay, I'm sure saying, can you please? Yes, on the road, will sand be taken along the coast? Okay, and this is a question that comes up all the time. What will it look like? Where will it be going? Unfortunately, as I said, we don't have that information just yet. The designers have started work. I can say that the existing pipeline system that runs from Glenelg down to Seacliff uses a number of those options that you've mentioned in that question. Sections of it, for example, in front of Minda Dunes, are buried in the beach. Sections of it are beneath the Coast Park Path, the footpath and the Coast Park Path along the coast. Sections of it are buried in the road, and sections of it are placed in the top of seawalls. So all of those options have been used in the southern pipeline. In terms of the northern pipeline, Tonkin, who are the design engineers that are part of that consortia that will be delivering the new pipeline, have just started that design work. They're looking at the previous alignment that was selected back in 2008. Remember, I said there was a development approval granted for a conceptual alignment. They're revisiting that, but they're essentially starting the whole process again. So they're taking all our survey data. They've been out walking along the coast looking at each site, and they're coming up with a draft concept alignment that's what I said we expect to have in the next 6 weeks or so, to be able to come back to people and say, well, this is what they're saying from their design perspective, taking into consideration the feedback from the community reference group, which said things like, don't go through sensitive dunes, get as much of the infrastructure underground as you can, put it under existing infrastructure if you can, make sure you locate the above ground infrastructure that you do have to have, make sure you locate that as far away from residences as possible. All of those sorts of issues have been provided to them. They're working through them and coming up with a draft, and we hope to have that out there for comment in the next 6 weeks or so. Where will sand be picked up from? Again, that's one of those issues that they're working through as well. We have engaged other consultants, an independent impact assessment. So interstate consultants Doug Lord and David Wainwright, who are analysing all of our survey data and looking at where the sand is, the dunes, how much sand's in the beach, how much sand's in the intertidal zone, how has that historically changed over time, and where should you be? That information will then inform where you should be having the inlets and outlets. I would expect, and the intent is certainly that sand would be picked up from along that stretch between West Beach and Semaphore. An obvious intake location is at the Semaphore Park breakwater. That's part of its purpose, is to trap sand for recycling. So there will definitely be an intake there. I would expect that there will also be an intake in the Grange area, exactly where I'm not sure, but there is large accumulations of sand in that area as well. The northern extent, how far north the pipeline goes, is yet to be finalised as well. The base project is to get that pipeline up to the Semaphore breakwater. That's one of the key areas of collection of sand. We also have to manage the area to the north of the breakwater. That breakwater has what we call a downdrift erosion effect. Because it stops sand for recycling, it does cause small-scale erosion to the north of it. At the moment, we truck sand back into that area. It would be nice if we could extend the pipeline further north and be able to manage that area with the pipeline instead of trucks. That's one of the main things we want to do with the pipeline, is reduce the reliance on trucks to move sand. But we don't know yet whether that's going to be feasible. That's part of the design process. What can we achieve within the existing budget? Sea level rise, I think, was also raised by Kay, and I'll come back to another one in a minute. One of the advantages of the pipeline system, as opposed to alternative solutions like structural solutions, is that you do have the flexibility to move sand from different areas of accumulation and deposit it at different locations. So it is very adaptive to both short-term changes in terms of seasonal and year-to-year changes. Remember, I talked about the DHI study saying the average rate of littoral drift out of West Beach was about 100,000 cubic metres per year. They also emphasise that it's highly variable, that it can range from between 50,000 cubic metres per year and 150,000 cubic metres per year. And that's the nature of managing a coastline, is that it's a natural process, it's a natural system. It can be highly variable. You can have very rough years, high rates of littoral drift. You can have mild years with moderate levels of littoral drift. With the pumping system, you can move different amounts of sand in response to those events. And it's proposed that the way we would design each year's sand movement campaign is based on survey data from the previous year, identifying how much sand has been lost from West Beach. That's how much sand we would be looking to bring back. And in that way, we're ensuring that we hold both West Beach stable in terms of the beach volumes, but also the volumes of the beaches further to the north stable. So we're not seeing any decline or increase in either of those beach systems. So in terms of responding to sea level rise, yes, the sand pumping system has the capacity to move more sand in response to increased rates of littoral drift in response to sea level rise. As sea levels rise, you do get increased levels of littoral drift. As you can imagine, those waves are getting incrementally higher and starting to attack higher up the beach and attacking the dunes more and moving more sand northwards along the coast. So it is the most adaptable solution in terms of sea level rise. Did Kay have another question? Right, no, sorry. Given Port Adelaide Semaphore, sorry, I was just going to do that top one. Port Adelaide Semaphore in terms of vulnerability to climate change and storms. So yes, absolutely, and that's part of the independent assessment that's currently being done by Doug Lord and David Wainwright, is what are the long-term impacts. Last year we engaged a separate impact assessment done by Water Technology on what were the impacts, an independent assessment of the impacts of the trucking works, the interim trucking works, and we now have another independent impact assessment looking at what's the long-term implications of the pipeline system. We obviously believe we understand them. DHI have expressed their views, but we're getting another independent set of eyes looking at that, analysing our survey data, examining the long-term sustainability. So the intent of the system, as I said, is not to result in a decline in the amount of sand in the northern beaches. Certainly the independent impact assessment last year concluded that with the amount of sand that we're taking trucking back from the northern beaches, those beaches will continue to grow. The dune buffers will continue to grow in the longer term based on those volumes. This independent impact assessment of the pipeline, we'll re-examine that in terms of the pipeline solution, but our intent is only to bring back the sand that's leaving West Beach. So that should have no net impact on the amount of sand in the northern beaches. So we're not looking to reduce the amount of sand in those northern beaches. The other important aspect is the Coast Protection Board supported the Port Adelaide sea level rise adaptation study, which looked at sea level rise, sea flooding and stormwater inundation back in the 2016, and then the adaptation study that flowed on from that, which I was on the steering committee for. The prime vulnerability of Port Adelaide, and in fact in through to West Lakes, is through around the back. It's through Port Adelaide and through the Port River. It's not through the frontal dune system. That's not where the issue is in terms of the flooding. It's in through the port and all those low-lying areas through the port. So that's where the recommended infrastructure changes are needed to future-proof Port Adelaide and those areas in terms of providing protection from inundation from the Port River. There's certainly no intention to draw back the dunes and reduce the protection from the coastal side. And Kay had another part of that. We've already seen the effect of sand cutting our beaches and the impact of storms after the sand. There is great concern in the community. Yes, I understand that, and that's part of that. That's why we commissioned that independent impact assessment about what is the impact of the trucking, and it is understood that is the way a coastline, when we remove sand from the beach, either through us trucking it away or a storm removing the sand, the way the coast responds to that is through two measures. So you've got literal drift replacing that sand that's been removed, so that river of sand moving along the coast, replacing the sand. But in the shorter term, with a lowered beach, it will erode the dunes to replace that sand that's been taken out of the... So it'll seek to achieve an equilibrium. When you lower the beach, you will get a resultant erosion of the dune face. In response to sea level rise, that's between about 1 in 50 and 1 in 100. So if you raise by 1 unit of sea level rise, you'll get about 50 units of erosion. So it's quite dramatic in response to those long-term sea level rise effects. Water technology concluded that yes, although there might be short-term erosion of the foredune, they estimated it from memory 3 to 6 metres. When we estimated, we were saying 4 to 8 metres before we did the works. Their conclusion was 3 to 6 metres, but that impact would be short-term. That's the way a foredune responds to sand being taken out, but that in the longer term, those beaches would continue to accumulate sand and those dunes would recover quickly. So yes, there is scarping in response to storms. Let me just cancel that. But that is expected to be a short-term impact, and those dunes will recover and those beaches will continue to grow. What is the pipeline pump proposed location? Yeah, so this comes back to the design of the pipeline, which is being worked on now, and I hope to have that concept for you out to you in about 6 weeks or so. The general principle, and based on the existing system from Glenelg to Kingston Park, is that you have a pump station and what's called a booster station roughly every 2 kilometres. It can vary between 2 to 2.5 kilometres, depending on the grain size and a number of hydraulic design parameters. But about every 2 kilometres, you need a booster station. Now, that's some of the issues they're working through at the moment, is where are the logical places to put them. That was worked through, again, back in 2008 as well, but they're starting from scratch. So there needs to be a pump station at the semaphore breakwater, and essentially every 2 kilometres or so, you need a booster station. Now, what they're trying to do is work through that process of locate those booster stations, which are underground chambers, but they do have a breather structure on top of them. They have to have a venting structure. What they're trying to do is locate them at obvious locations where there's a section of reserve or a public toilet or some other public infrastructure that they can co-locate those pump stations with to minimise the impact on adjoining residents. So I can't answer that question at the moment. We'll hope to have a concept plan in that six weeks or so. but they're certainly endeavouring to locate those pump stations at the locations of other infrastructure. I would also mention that last year we ran tours for the existing sand pumping system, and we'll be doing that again this year, probably from July onwards, I would suggest, when it's in operation again. That's when it starts its work, and that's when it pumps sand from Glenelg to the southern beaches. So on our website, or you can register your interest on our website or tonight. We've got a register of people who are interested on going on those tours. We ran a number of them last year that were quite well attended. It gives you a chance to see the existing system in operation, what the sand collection end looks like, what the pump stations look like, and what the discharge ends look like. The booster pumps themselves are actually very quiet. You can stand right next to them and it sounds like a gentle hum. You can feel a gentle vibration in your feet. You can be standing right next to them and barely hear anything. It's the sand collection end that does have some noise. It's got a rotating screen and sand is being loaded in. Yeah. Another question. What are the impacts of noise from pumping stations on nearby houses? How loud are they? How far away they can be heard? What hours will they be running? Yes, so as I was just saying, the pump stations are actually very quiet. You can literally stand right next to them and you can barely hear them. They're not really the issue because they're underground. They do have a visual impact in that, as I said, they do have those breather towers. If you drive along the Esplanade down Seacliff, Brighton, North Glenelg, every 2 kilometres or so, you'll see a square block that protrudes about 2.5 metres up. It's probably about 2 metres, 1.5 metres by 1.5 metres at the top of the seawall, and you'll see vents at the top of it. That's the breather towers on top of the pump stations. But other than that visual impact, they're very quiet. It's the sand collection unit where you pick up the sand and put it into the system. There is a screening plant in the existing system. And again, we're hoping to make significant improvements to the system that was first delivered at Glenelg. There's new opportunities to do this 10 years later and do it better and make improvements. But that's where the main impact is. And as we talked about earlier, the idea is to be able to collect sand from different sections along the coast. So I would envisage that sand collection unit would be one location for a month, then it would move to another location for a month, and then another location for a month to be feeding sand into the system. So there is the intent to try and pick up sand evenly along the coast and also to minimise the impact on one section of coast or one section of residents. How often will they be running? How loud are they? So the current system runs from 7:30 to 4 p.m. generally. They have approval in terms of the EPA operational hours to run from 7 till 5. So they have to comply with the EPA noise requirements, and they measure those. They use noise readers at the nearest property. And in the case at Glenelg, that you've got residential apartments probably only 40 metres away from where the sand collection unit is operating. Obviously, up this northern end, we're going to have much more opportunity to have much more significant buffer distances between where the pump stations are and residences, but they need to be able to meet those noise requirements at about 40 to 50 metres at Glenelg, and they do. But again, it's very difficult to describe. The best way to understand it really is to come and have a look in July when the existing system is operating and get a feel for it there. With the disclaimer, I would say that I hope that the new system will be better, quieter and less disruptive. How far away can they be heard? Hours of running, it's only Monday to Friday, and at the moment they operate 7:30 till 4. They can be on site before that, getting organised, but in terms of running the system, it generally operates between those hours of 7:30 and 4 o'clock. Happy to take any more, otherwise I can, while people are thinking, I might just come to what's coming up. The next round of sand movement works. Oh, can you describe the sand collection process? Yes, okay. I wonder if I might jump to some pictures that I've got later in the presentation, if I can, if this works. Oh, no, I can't find it. Too much information here. Where is that?
The land plane.
Okay, hopefully I'm sharing that. So on the top left image there, you'll see what we call the land plane. Essentially, it's a tractor towing a scraper, and that scraper scrapes a layer of sand off the beach, which is collected in the top of the scraper. It then drives to the top of the beach, drops the sand at the top of the beach, where an excavator loads it in to a screening plant. It gets up a conveyor belt and dropped into the pumping system. This is what we call the sand collection unit. So this is the temporary infrastructure that's set up on Glenelg Beach, and then they operate for about a month and a half, 2 months to the southern side of the jetty. That's the Grand, just off to the left. Then they move to the northern side of the jetty in front of the apartments on the northern side of the jetty and undertake the same operation there. So the infrastructure that's involved, the equipment that's involved, is this. The equipment that's driving around on the beach is this land plane. The tractor towing the land plane, scraping a thin layer of sand off the beach, driving up to the top of the beach, heading out again to pick up more sand. The rest of the infrastructure is sitting at the top of the beach, feeding the sand into the system. Essentially, it then gets into the underground system and is pumped along that underground system and discharged as a slurry out the other end of the system. Essentially, that slurry is discharged onto the beach. The beach is not closed. You can easily walk along, if you've got bare feet, along the beach through the discharge area. The water runs off, the sand drops out of that slurry, raises the whole level of the beach progressively. Then we move to the next discharge point and raise the next section of the beach. So that's essentially what the system looks like. The top right picture is just at the base of Glenelg Jetty on one of the tours we ran in July, August this year. And you can see that in the background that's what the current system looks like. So it has to be right on the beach. It gets set up, then all that equipment gets removed, goes off into an offsite storage until the next year's round of works. We're hoping that there will be improvements to that where we've got a bit more space up north, rather than being constrained to the top of the beach and the wall, that we'll be able to do a more discrete system that works more efficiently at getting the sand into the beach. But I anticipate that anything we do will involve a land plane picking up sand off the beach. That's the main way that sand gets collected off beaches. That's the most efficient way to do it. How we get it into the sand pumping system is where the design improvements can be made. It is going to involve some kind of land plane, but not those large yellow earth-moving trucks that currently drive on the beaches with the sand. Let me go again back to just quickly finalise before you'll disappear what's coming up, what to look out for. So the next thing that will be happening is that we do need those. Remember I talked about those interim sand tracking works to hold West Beach. We do need the next round of those works will start in May, and we would expect them. We've just finished some works at Semaphore to do some replenishment at Semaphore South. The next round of works will commence in May, and we expect them to go for in the order of 2 months. We're doing them later than usual this year to try and do it when the beaches are less busy. That does mean we're exposed to more likelihood of worse weather. So it may take us a little bit longer than we would usually be on there for. That's part of the trade-off. We're doing that in response to feedback from the Semaphore Working Group, our stakeholder reference group at Semaphore. And the key thing, I guess, in terms of the pipeline system to watch out for is that in the next 6 to 8 weeks or so, from May onwards, we'll be starting consultation with something to actually look at in terms of where will the pipeline be going, what will that look like? Where is it going to be going? So that's the key next steps. You can register on our website to get ongoing updates. We are also using a new system now where you can register your mobile phone number to get SMS updates when works are happening, if you want to know what's changes or if we're working on which section of beach. I do come out and do presentations to community groups when invited. Happy to do that. If there's a group of people who are interested, always happy to come and answer questions and explain the project. And we've got a QR code. You'll see signs out along the coast. You can scan that QR to keep informed about what's going on. No more questions at this stage. I'll take third and final call for questions. And unless there are any more, appreciate you making the time to come and listen to my discussion of what's coming up and what's going on. And hopefully I've been able to answer some of your questions. There will be plenty of opportunities going forward as we work and progress the design of the system to ask more questions and have your input into that process. So thanks very much for that. And also, sorry, one final thing, if you do see the caravan out there, whenever we're doing works, we try and get it's a little old-fashioned, cute, sort of 70s bubble caravan, pretty hard to miss. Wherever we're doing works, we try and have that out there with Linda, Janet, or myself, or another member of the project team. Come up to us and say hello. It's another chance to ask more questions. So thanks very much for your time.